in researching the exhibition on view at Sculpture Center, which touches on this history by primarily investigating parallels between humor, technology, changing relationships between 2D and 3D space, notions of animating space, and during, looking back at the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, which some of the films we watched tonight were made in, to the Third Industrial Revolution, which we are currently in the digital age. It became apparent that this moment around the Second Industrial Revolution, animation represented a significant opening around notions of humor and new spatial configurations. And at the forefront of those conversations were responses and discussions by Adorno, Benjamin, also the film critic and filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, and the major studios at this time, which were primarily Disney and the Fleischer brothers. The exhibition and this film program were informed by how these cartoons really created virtual realities in their own time in response to an increasing mechanization of society and really imagining virtual realities before virtual reality as we understand it now. So, to begin our discussion, which will center on this history, and really yesterday there were a lot of these early Disney and Fleischer films, and we had a couple in this program today. And so, I think we can talk about this history, but also make connections to contemporary concerns around animation space, humor, and technology. And I just wanted to ask you, Esther, about this debate around the impact of early cartoons on society at the time, primarily affecting American culture, with Disney as the primary actor. And I was wondering if you could elucidate those positions and arguments which were taking place, to put it very simply, whether cartoons sedated the masses, as Adorno feared, or eased their suffering and added some color into people's lives during times of economic collapse and war, as Benjamin and Eisenstein proposed.
Yeah, I mean, those are the parameters to a very lively debate, and in some ways it depends when it's being explored, because probably a more classical position, or what we might assume from a bunch of European intellectuals, would be the position that Adorno takes, where Disney becomes utterly emblematic of this cultural industry that's all geared towards seducing and sedating the masses, and it's not even silly, illogic, or absurd distraction. It's something far more calculated and sadistic, and we watched Donald Duck in order to learn how to take our own beating, and what's worse than the generation of masochistic impulses in us is that we laugh at it, as we saw in Ha Ha Ha, this laughing that's going to be set off by animation will seep out across the city, and you can't escape it in a way. That would be the ultimate negative vision of what Disney comes to mean. But that's originally it's Horkheimer who says that in about 1942 at the point when he and Adorno have come to America in leaving Nazi Germany and fascist Europe behind. And then Adorno and Horkheimer take up this position again in 44, 47 in their Dialectic of Enlightenment. And we might expect that sort of view in some ways. But there's just that earlier moment, around the later 1920s and 1930, when Walter Benjamin, Sergei Eisenstein, and countless others are encountering an earlier guise of animation, the first kind of days of Mickey Mouse as this rather anarchic, ratty figure, and the shock for them of seeing a world in cartoons in which everything, is energetic all across the space of the screen. There's pulsation and energy and movement and interactions and a complete unpredictability about what will happen next, and all the laws of physics suspended or overturned. So even this apparently always the same replicating thing called nature is overturned in animation, or played with in the ways that fairy tales plays with nature, and that it comes, animals intermingle with humans or come in on their side or enter into relationships with them. So, they start to see it as laying out this whole field of possibility and provisionality, and that comes to be read for Eisenstein particularly in a kind of utopian guise. This is a protoplasmic, endlessly self-forming and reforming world that might come as a kind of consolation for people who he characterises in Depression era America, the greyness. This is a consolation, but at the same time it opens up new vistas, and I think that's also, in a sense, the way Walter Benjamin takes it as well, perhaps with more of a sense that cartoons do teach us. They deal with these three big things that, us humans, nature in the guise of animals and environment, and technology, and all the different playoffs and all the antagonisms and all of the possibilities that these three things in this spinning permanent play can come into, and that's both a training for how we live in modernity, but also again indication to us that we might be able to steer our fate, or we might be able to work with the contradictions and produce something new. So I think that those are the parameters of the debate, and it shifts as the culture itself shifts, and as cartoons harden and formalise, and Disney comes to grow into a particular representative of a certain kind of cultural form.
And what do you see? I mean, because there's this strong relationship between slapstick and cartoons at the time of the kind of new humor coming out of vaudeville, and Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton obviously as references, but this relationship between animation and live action film at that time was really interesting and intermingled. And I know you write about Chaplin, who was sort of concerned about it was Felix the cat, sort of stealing his gags, and he could, he didn't have to breathe, so he could he could be funnier in some way, and really this, but both slapstick films and these early cartoons were really centered on the relationship between humor and technology. So it was really about like machines acting like people, people acting like machines, and this really sort of butting up between animate and inanimate objects and characters, but really this relationship between technology and humor at the time. Was there, what sort of role do you think that played, and what was its implication in that particular moment?
I mean, I think there's lots of things. It is odd with Chaplin. Chaplin's always a reference point in the sense that he was understood as a kind of cipher or as a symbol, in the same way that many of the commentators, say in France particularly, looking at Felix the cat and so on, would see him as an ideogram, or as a symbol, as this, this black entity in a white background, just like Chaplin, sort of reduced down to these few repeatable elements, but which are then sort of endlessly manipulable. And Felix has the tail, which he can take off. Chaplin has the cane, and it's funny how much flow there is between the two, such that there is the film where Felix and a cartoon version of Chaplin appear together, and then Chaplin's own comments about the fact that he's going to be made redundant by the cartoons, but because they can, which is kind of part of the theme in certain ways of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, is sort of that things will be overhauled and overtaken, and you know, that's struggling maybe with a new age of digitalization and so on. But Chaplin, seeing the cartoons can do all of his sort of graphic, impossible contorting without having to take a breath. They do it effortlessly. And I suppose, I mean, that the relationship between technology and humour, common to Chaplin and common to animation, is this basing around the gag. You know, there's no longer the narrative. The story, in a sense, doesn't matter. It's how you get from gag to gag, these short segments which break things down into smaller parts. Perhaps, you know, in some sense, like the mechanisation of labour as industrialisation has taken place, and tasks are broken down into these smaller discrete units which may or may not be repeatable. That might be part of their element. So there's a sense in which the very narrative itself and the acting within it seems to reflect on a certain kind of mechanisation, segmentation and division of parts, division of labour. And then within the scenarios themselves, there's these engagements with technology. I mean, there's an early Donald Duck film I was thinking of when we were looking at the Cruikshank piece, because they're sort of encountering these future technologies, and Donald Duck goes to this sort of exhibition of future technologies, and just like Chaplin in modern times in 36 as well, you're exposed to these new labour-saving devices, machines that are going to feed you, and of course, you know, Chaplin and Donald Duck just get totally stuck inside the machinery and totally beaten up by it, and totally exposed to it in the most monstrous way that's very, very funny for audiences, but utterly sort of devastating and humiliating for them. But of course they pass out the other side unscathed, as is mostly the way things go in animation. So part of that is all part of this working through what have we done in technologising the world, in producing all of these machines that are meant to help us. But we find, as with the primal site of that machinery in the first industrial revolution, you know, it comes along to automate processes, and yet what it actually produces is a greater social machine that will be factory capitalism, within which, as Marx puts it, you know, the worker will become an appendage of the machine, reactive to its rhythms, conjured or animated in a sense into being by that machinery. And cartoons, you know, they seem to play with that, or dramatise it, or lay it out, perhaps without comment, or perhaps in a fully sort of self-reflexive way. But you know, it's at work there, and Benjamin's fascinated by the way in which it's turned into the opportunity for humour. You know, this exposure to the machine can make us laugh, or we could try and regain some mastery over it by turning it into humour, so it becomes a sort of therapeutic thing. But at the same time, it's also part of a sort of new realism in the least realistic guise, because it's really trying to show the ways in which machinery has inveigled itself into our lives.
Yeah, and there's sort of this like ambivalence to the humor that's really interesting, where it sort of offers, you know, it's satirical, but it offers some relief. And I mean, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit more about then the like fear and violence that's also really taking place in a lot of these cartoons in relationship to new technologies at the time, which we just kind of talked about. Then also war and that kind of wartime context in which bodies are being fragmented, and you know, you see that a lot in these animations too, where there's a loss of control.
Yeah, it's funny. It's when Walter Benjamin has this little conversation with a couple of friends that he takes notes on in 1931, and it's about Mickey Mouse, and for him that he sees the sort of the loss of limbs, or the sometimes just a temporary loss of limbs, or twisting of the body into certain shapes as a symbol or as a sign of alienation, that nothing is inviolate somehow. So just as we sell our labour power, the version of this in the cartoons is the loss of a limb, or its contortion into some sort of serviceable part. So I mean there's part of seeing what happens to the body in a wider sort of notion of alienation and submission of the self to I suppose capitalistic impulses, but also I suppose more specifically, I mean, if you look at something like the very, very early Disney film Plane Crazy, there's this extraordinary scene where they're trying to get this plane up and going, and it's actually a vision of quite a subtle division of labour, and Mickey and all his friends are sort of working on different bits, like they're in a sort of plane making factory in the First World War, and maybe that's the sort of memory that's working through it. And then at one point, one of the characters puts himself inside the plane to be some sort of rotator that's going to help the propeller go round. So he's just sort of twisted into this long, band in order to set the plane off. And again, it's that sort of level of incorporation and identification in the machinery and the violence that necessitates, that's just laid out there as a funny gag. So I mean, Adorno writes to Benjamin very critically in terms of his utopian vision of Mickey Mouse and his friends. Benjamin calls Mickey this sort of earth-encircling universal figure through which we could all, the whole world sort of jumps to his rhythm and identifies, and there's something internationalist about him. And Adorno won't have any of it, and much more sort of points to the sadism and subjection. So Benjamin sort of starts to revise his opinion and starts talking about the violence that you see in the cartoons as foreshadowing, as reminiscent of its source material, which is the Grimm's German fairy tale and medieval pogroms, and also is sort of looking forward, gesturing towards the fact that there's a kind of fascistic mentality that's in this fire magic, he calls it, that's being portrayed on the screen. And I suppose there can't, there's not, I mean, there's certainly a relationship to war that's going to emerge by the 1940s, when all of Disney's production has to be commandeered for the war effort. But in interesting ways, I mean, the very bizarre film Victory Through Air Power, where he represented the thesis of a Russian whose ideas he'd taken on board, that the Second World War could only be won through an air campaign. But then also, the very funny and very astute of Donald Duck movies like Der Führer's Face and so on, which really used humour to take the mickey out of Nazi Germany, and saw quite astute things there around this very complex of nature. There's a scene where Goebbels and Hirohito and all of the fascists are sort of marching along in caricaturish form in a marching band, and the clouds are in swastika shapes, sort of recognising the extent to which the fascist idea even could, it would wish to inhabit natural form in naturalising itself as an ideology. So war could sort of enter these cartoons in other ways as well.
Well, and to kind of maybe switch gears to think about animism and how animism plays into these early cartoons, and there's this intersection between the child animal machine that's really interesting, and we've seen it throughout this program, and there's a lot of like psychoanalytical and political assessments of this dynamic, like in How to Read Donald Duck. There's like a really specific discussion about how the sort of family tree of these a lot of these cartoon characters, but there's like I'm just curious to know what you think this particular motivation was for, and the sort of cultural landscape, how it really seeded this tendency to anthropomorphize animals and bringing a disparate range of animals and different animate and inanimate entities to life and to interact.
Yeah, so there's different ways one could take it, because there is a much longer history, isn't there, within caricaturing and so on, of using the animal to represent the human. I mean, there's a figure from the mid-19th century, Granville, who does these sort of extraordinary comic books or picture books of animals dressed as humans. Partly Lewis Carroll or John Tenniel in his drawings for Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass was inspired by Granville and his dressed up frogs and so on. And in using the animal to have human traits, you defamiliarize it. You make it strange. So a lot of Granville's skits were, would be flowers dressed up in the latest fashions, or a balcony around the planet Saturn for people to flaneur on, and it's sort of throwing into deep relief the very historical and contingent modes of human behaviour which seem all the time to naturalise themselves. So there's something anti-mythical in dressing up animals in human guise, but then you can also take it from a much longer trajectory of this recurrent recourse of humans to animistic thinking, which was the very much the motivation in a bizarre way for Marx to think about fetishism and commodity fetishism, and to take that idea that, here are all these anthropologists of the mid-19th century belittling say, African peoples for their fetishism and animism, which meant that they would quite happily give away gold that meant nothing to them for pebbles that they thought, had magical properties. And how stupid were these people? And Marx just turns it on its head and says, but how stupid are you to think the gold is so magical? You're just, it's the same sort of fetishism which will then commute over into capitalist society more widely through commodity fetishism and so that's just sort of one instance of a kind of modernised recurrence of fetishistic thinking and the attribution of life and agency and power more broadly, or outside of human relations. I suppose cartoons instage that, but as they do it, much of the time it almost seems like a sort of democratic or enfranchising gesture as well. That's part of the utopianism of it too, isn't it? That it's not just us, or that these feelings that we have, about the malice of objects, or the all this stuff that now vital materialisms and speculative realism and so on work with. This idea that objects produce us and are involved in social relations with us. That's how it feels to us all the time. That's what we dream about too. But it's not what positivism can bear. But there it is. We go on thinking it, and children are born again and again, imagining that their dolls talk, or you know, that their animals understand them. And so it's a sort of ontogenetic and phylogenetic and or human response to things, and cartoons are just one manifestation of working that through, I suppose, and wanting it to be true again.
I mean, I think it's really fascinating to look at, you know, how these technologies have changed over time, and even that generations are brought up at least watching some of these cartoons over and over again because of their just like as drawings, they're sort of more timeless than a lot of film. But really what's interesting is these early cartoons is this mixture of live action and animation. As we saw with the Ha 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 and the Disney cartoons, this is sort of a strategy in a way of the self-reflective animation, where, you know, the cartoonist is drawing the cartoon coming to life. And then, you know, 1988 with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was the first feature-length film where there were live actors and animated characters sharing equal screen time, and it sort of marked this pivotal transitional moment between analog and digital production. But, you know, it was really, you know, it's interesting to think about this as these films really underscoring this changing relationship between flatness and depth and anti-physics, as you discuss it in your book. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about this relationship between live action and animation, and these this collision in the early cartoons and that history.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that it was there from the start. I mean, Winsor Mackay, who was making, well, first of all doing these gorgeous newspaper supplement comic strips, you know, around 1905, 1906 onwards, of Little Nemo in Slumberland. Then in 1911 he animates Little Nemo in Slumberland, but that begins, it's all live action, but it's live action precisely about the animation office, you know, in a tall building in New York, and you know, and Mackay was always very aware of the physical and material resources needed for animation. I mean, one of his other animations was a sort of documentary newsreel, Sinking of the Lusitania, where he didn't use any of the labour-saving methods of, you know, cell overlays or repeated strips and so on. He would hand animate every single frame, thousands and thousands of them. And in his animation of Little Nemo, so it begins in the offices, and you see the barrels and barrels of ink and the piles and piles of paper, and then, you know, it moves into this little segment, almost like a magical moment of Nemo and Little Imp and all his friends appearing on the paper, and then stretching and squashing and just being animated, almost like a pure act of animation. But of course that's absolutely separate then from the frame story, which is the place where animation is made. So it's a sort of different dynamic, I suppose. That's why the Disney Alice in what are they called again? Alice in Wonderland. Is it Wonderland?
Cartoonland.
Cartoonland, that's it. It's so strange because it's sharing that space, isn't it? And getting
it's Alice's Wonderland.
Alice's Wonderland, starting to
going to Cartoonland.
Thinking about the different, you know, the mergings of two different ontologies. I mean, that accompanies animation almost from its very beginnings, and that's the self-reflexivity that some studios are going to continue more than others, aren't they? The sort of Tex Avery end of things is going to keep that up. Its whole gags are going to come from the inside outside of the cartoon, and the cartoonists and the cartoon characters displaying an awareness of their representational codes and what's outside them, and so on. And I suppose animation sort of uniquely holds open the possibility of that space, and that you can have pick up a black hole, throw it down, and it becomes a puddle, a hole, a portal, or all of these things. I mean, that's sort of unique to the understanding of the meeting points of these different worlds.
I think we have time for a couple questions from the audience, if there are any questions. No.
I have a question.
Okay.
I want to talk to you guys about a book that I was talking to you, one of your sculpture colleagues, called The Dinosaur Wars. It's about who these cartoons are for, in terms of especially when they were in America, and you're talking a lot about Walter Benjamin and other Russian filmmakers, socialists who talk a lot about the people, but I'm not sure if they have very much knowledge of who the people are. And I wanted to know, were cartoons very popular with a group of people where English was not their first language? Was it like cartoons? It was a very comfortable medium for people who may have had old world sensibilities, and they were in new environments. The way Nemo and all those cartoons were very popular to an immigrant population here in New York and maybe elsewhere in the world, a displaced population. So what I want to know is, was there a more educated group of people in Europe and America who had a different sense of the cartoons, and a less educated or less formally educated group of people that had a different sense and a different appearance of the cartoon?
I don't know. I mean, I think, of course, there's a lot of speaking for others, aren't there? So, Benjamin makes this great claim that the public that is, he doesn't use this language, but freaked out by surrealism is totally into Chaplin, but Chaplin's doing the same thing. He's messing up time and space relations. He's, displaying illogic. The context matters, and Benjamin's assumption was, as was the actuality, was that masses and masses of people were going to these cartoons and enjoying them. I mean, that's uncontestable. I suppose the argument is what they take from them, or if they're taking the same readings from them as the European intellectuals, or all the artists, the Dadaists or the surrealists, and all these people who saw them as giving them inspiration to change their art, to throw away their paintings and canvases and to make animations, abstract animations, for the most part, instead, because they wanted something of that rhythm, something of that motion and mobility, and something of that engagement with what contemporary modern life felt like. And whether audiences are seeing them in the same way, they're certainly accepting some pretty wild visions of the world. So there was that popularity of that New York series of films, not animations as such, the Looney Lenses ones, where they do a lot of mirroring and split screening, and the whole city of skyscrapers would sort of swirl kaleidoscopically and collapse, and it's this sort of optically, visually sophisticated gags which are also doing the same things on the screen as all the montagists in the rarefied art galleries are doing on their photographs. So I think what people are responding to, what they think about it, I don't know, how do we know, but what they're responding to has the same kind of aesthetic parameters and outlines, from advanced art to the funnies, and that's just what some of these thinkers are picking up on, I suppose, and learning from, thinking about.
I just want to read a little bit of this quote that you quote of Benjamin, where he says, "Who could better corroborate experiences like Mickey Mouse in his films? A Mickey Mouse film might be incomprehensible to the individual, but not to a public. And a Mickey Mouse film can direct a whole public rhythmically." It's kind of an interesting way of...
Yeah, that sort of idea that these are, it's not like the artwork that you stand in front of individually and, you wonder what it means and you come up with your own meaning or none at all. It's not like that. It's whole cinemas of people almost becoming like a collective body, sort of laughing together and experiencing together and sort of sharing and understanding. And I suppose that's one of the things that interests Benjamin about film, or that allows him to see it as so totally embedded in the modern urban experience, and not just as a distraction of that, but as a kind of training ground or a place where we go to try and accommodate ourselves to the speediness, to the shock nature of the experience. We're sort of our organs are being worked on and refined in that setting.
I mean, it's kind of amazing with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, if you guys haven't seen it in a while or didn't see it on Friday. It's just so incredibly self-reflexive, and it just encapsulates this entire history in some way of cartoons and the reception, and it's set in Los Angeles in the 40s, and it's this whole plot about this destruction, this gentrification of Los Angeles, and this destruction of Toontown, and the Toons is this sort of underclass, that's out of work and really irritating and everything else, but and so they're going to pave over Toontown to make way for a highway, which is like ludicrous to because at that time LA had the best public transportation system in the world, to quote one of the characters, but yeah, so that's but like all these characters from different studios are coming together. It really sort of caps off a moment, and it's 1988. It's a really important time. It wasn't made using digital technology, but it was really anticipating this moment and really possible because of where the technology was going and where it had come. And then there's the first feature-length computer animated film in 1995, Toy Story, which is not that great. I mean, it's like a totally different situation, and I'm just there's this this shift into digital technology and also multiple platforms in which we're viewing these animations. I'm just curious about your thoughts in terms of animation and its relationship to and its current relationship to art and culture, and sort of the role it functions today.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? We're looking back at Roger Rabbit. It's almost like what it brings out about animation is a certain moment of flatness. I mean, there's all that flexibility, and the characters are performing in the filmic space, which is a 3D space. But ultimately, the thing I was aware of was just that flatness, and the villain gets sort of flattened at the end, a gesture repeated from endless kind of Roadrunner and Tom and Jerry movies, where they're always going to be made flatter than flat, even though they're already just flat things. And what we live in now is the 3D computer age, this illusory bulbousness, which seems to just have utterly sort of overtaken. It's about all children's animation virtually now. A different and going along with that is certain kinds of intensified realism and the technology of animated. I mean, what was it in Frozen? So, I don't know, 2 million hairs on Elsa's head or whatever, or all of that. The physics that go the snow physics that occurs in Frozen has sort of pushed things yet again to another level of snow dynamics. So when they throw a snowball and the snow flies off, that is utterly true to physics, and they're working it all out and so that the film becomes sort of organised around the technical achievement, which is organised around its naturalistic appearance and scientific validity. So it's a real shift away from the foregrounding of anti-physics or the overcoming of physics of an earlier kind of age. And we really do seem sort of separated from that earlier moment. So, I mean, in art terms, I was quite fascinated by Matthias Polledner, who's in LA, who was the Austrian entry for the Venice Biennale last year, and he made this 3-minute segment, utterly pastiched, perfect recreation of a Disney style film, and it really was so perfectly done. He used a lot of Disney animators who could still just about remember the some of the old ways of doing things, and that it seems there's a few artists who are looking back at that as really a lost or past moment, and a number of them, I suppose Jordan Wolfson sort of works in some ways with this as well, with the sort of interest in old style, the look anyway of old style cell animation and the kind of the stock characters stuff, and there's often a reference on the part of those artists to Adorno and the culture industry, and a sort of wondering about what that moment meant, whether was sort of still within it or beyond it. But it seems to be a certain kind of reference point for certain artists. I mean, I find the Mark Leckey thing, is kind of extraordinary. He keeps returning to Felix the cat, and I mean that piece is called Flicks, which I don't. Do you say that here in England? You talk about the flicks as the movies, and so Felix, Flicks, the flicker, the flicking tail. It's this extraordinary compression of elements into, then this very simple, quite sort of strangely erotic, or is that just me? Movement of the tail, where and the point it almost makes that question mark, but back to front that it makes in the Felix movies. But I think partly that's being mobilised. Felix the cat was the first cartoon character to be really merchandised, and then I mean that, and isn't that totally what animated films are about now? I mean they're less about the actual appearance of the film in the movies, and they're much more about selling the dresses in the Disney store and the Frozen branded lollies and apples and so on. And Felix sort of starts out at the same time. He's also the test character for New York TV broadcasts, so he's there at the beginnings of another technology that's going to get going before even cinema has really reached its apex. So it's as if this flexibility, this form that's all about flexibility and mutability, is already flexing or flicking itself into the next technology of distraction and entertainment. I think it's interesting how artists are reflecting at this moment on that whole history as a kind of trajectory at that point when elements of it do seem very different to the environment that we inhabit in an animated sense now, but that's why we can begin to see them, I suppose.
I think that's maybe a good note to end on, although thank you so much, Esther, for coming to New York and talking with us. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight.
Thank you.